funny, actually. Actually, on Friday night we were doing Learner's Minion, Rob, and we said, "Hey, Rob, if you're on the if you're on the if you're on the road," we said, "Hey, some of our friends are on the road." YouTube, but it's actually on our website.
Yeah.
If you go to our website, yeah.
Yeah.
So, as I was saying here, we are on part 2, but Adult Educations with me are like Law and Order episodes, which means if you've missed one, don't worry. Same characters, same stuff. Last time, we spoke about, from the book of Joshua, we spoke about what it meant to have succession, prophetic succession, from Moses to Joshua, and then we took a story from the prophets about Elijah and Elisha. I wanted to bring in for this teaching session something from Judges. And the book of Judges is something we don't get to study a lot. It is an awesome, awesome book. And inside of the book of Judges is this really important story and poem that we call Deborah's Song. And today we are going to open up Deborah's Song and see what we can see by it. The context here is important, and there's a lot of text, okay? There's a lot of text in this. Deborah's Song is long, and the context is long. But what we have here is a story in the book of Judges. Now, the book of Judges takes place when there is no monarchy over the people of Israel, okay? It is a time of charismatic leaders that rise in power and then inevitably fall out of power. But these are temporary, charismatic leaders that are called judges. So the book of Judges is there's no one king. People who are chosen by God to lead the Israelites in battle, and these sort of aspects. This is who we're talking about here. And this here, Deborah, is our judge, okay? And so I want us to take through the context. If you were open up Judges 4, and by the way, if you open up Judges 1, 2, 3, 4, you'll see these opening words or something similar to it. The Israelites saw or did again which was offensive to God. Okay? We're using Yahweh here, of course, to remove any theology. And Yahweh surrendered them to King Jabin of Canaan. In other words, once again, and this happens all the time, you can date it all the way back to Exodus, can't we? Right? Is that the Israelites do something that is bad, and God punishes them. Okay? Here, it's saying King Jabin of Canaan reigned in Hazor. His army was commanded by Sisera. The Israelites cried out to Yahweh, for he had 900 iron chariots, and he had oppressed Israel ruthlessly for 20 years. Okay? Deborah, our star, wife of Lapidoth, was a prophetess. She led Israel at that time. In other words, she was the judge. Okay? She was the leader. Okay? She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. This is northern territory, okay? And the Israelites would come to her for decisions, just like you would to a judge, okay? And here's the thing. Next time on the 17th, we're going to be speaking a lot and learning a lot about North and South and kings and that sort of stuff. Right now, I just want you to sort of get into the story. Don't worry so much about the who's who or whatever it is. Get into the idea that here we are in a time of chaos. The Israelites have no leader. Then there is a leader, and it's this prophetic, charismatic leader.
I find it interesting that they don't have a problem with a female charismatic leader.
Oh,
yet that
no.
same leader could not wear tefillin.
Oh, well.
Or sit
From our last class you're talking about. Yes. So the book of Judges, a lot of female leadership, a lot of female awesomeness in the book of Judges. So the laws that you're talking about later, right, totally different in terms of when the rabbis got a hold of it and said what's what or whatever it is. So hard to, but Deborah does come up, and Miriam comes up, and they're held in high esteem. But again, our last conversation was about what does it mean to be exempt from commandments and that sort of stuff, right? So for us, it means you don't have to, but you can. For them, it means you can, right? So all that stuff. So you're right. It is hard sometimes, Rob, to not put in our the rabbinic laws and things that we are so familiar back into the stories, right? What I want us to try to do, though, in this class in particular, right, is to throw the glasses away and say, good stories. Let's look at the stories. But it's hard to do that, right? So, and I think we'll encounter some of that. So, she summoned Barak, son of Abinoam of Kedeshah, Naphtali, don't worry, and said to him, Yahweh, the God of Israel, has commanded, go march up to Mount Tabor and take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun. These are tribes of Israel. And I will draw Sisera, Jabin's army commander, with his chariots and his troops towards you up to the Wadi Kishon, and I will deliver him into your hands. Deborah says this to Barak, okay? Deborah, who's a prophetess, says, take 10,000 people up there from these tribes, go bring in Sisera, and I will take care of him, okay? We hear this a lot from God, right? I'll deliver them into your hands, okay? In other words, Deborah is saying, do this and you'll win the battle, okay? But Barak said to her, if you will go with me, I will go. If not, I will not go. Very well, I will go with you, she answered. However, there will be no glory for you in the course you are taking, for then Yahweh will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. Okay? So you can, right? So she's no dummy, right? She says, I can go with you, but I was going to give you the credit. Not anymore, right? So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. Barak then mustered Zebulun and Naphtali at Kadesh. The 10,000 men from these Israelite tribes marched up after him, and Deborah also went up in him. So then we move to verse 12. Sisera was informed that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor. So Sisera ordered all his chariots, 900 iron chariots, and all the troops he had to move from Harosheth Goyim, that's where he was stationed, to the Wadi Kishon. Then Deborah said to Barak, up, this is the day on which Yahweh will deliver Sisera into your hands. Yahweh is marching before you.
Is that up meaning like wake up?
Wake up, get up, yep.
Morning.
Pay attention, yes. Yes, kumi, right, rise up, right? Barak charged down Mount Tabor, followed by the 10,000 men, and Yahweh threw Sisera and all his chariots and army into a panic before the onslaught of Barak. Sisera leaped from his chariot and fled on foot. As Barak pursued the chariots and the soldiers as far as Harosheth Goyim, where they had started, all of Sisera's soldiers fell by the sword. Not a man was left. Hooray, right? So his army gets defeated, okay? Just as Deborah says. Then we get to see, this is why the book of Judges is so great, okay? Sisera, meanwhile, had fled on foot to the tent of Yael, wife of Heber the Kenite. There was a friendship between King Jabin of Hazor and the family of Heber the Kenite. In other words, this Canaanite person had a treaty with these people, so Sisera feels safe. Yael came out to greet Sisera and said to him, come in, does that say Lord on yours?
Yeah.
Okay, mine says my Yahweh, because I did an auto change to, sorry. Okay, but as long as yours is correct. Okay, come in, my Lord, not God, come in, my Lord. Come in here, do not be afraid. So he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. He said to her, please let me have some water. I'm thirsty. She opened a skin of milk and gave him some to drink. And she covered him again. He said to her, stand at the entrance of the tent. If anybody comes and asks you if there is anybody here, say no. Then Yael, wife of Heber, took a tent pin and grasped the mallet. And when he, meaning Sisera, was fast asleep from exhaustion, she approached him stealthily and drove the pin through his temple till it went down in the ground. Thus he died.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah. Big, important scene, okay? Yael's tent, big scene, okay? Now Barak appeared in pursuit of Sisera. Jael went out to greet him and said, "Come, I will show you the man you're looking for." He went inside with her, and there Sisera was lying dead with the pin in his temple. On that day, God subdued King Jabin of Canaan before the Israelites. The hand of the Israelites bore harder and harder on King Jabin of Canaan until they destroyed King Jabin of Canaan. Okay? Okay. First of all, awesome story, right? Deborah the prophetess, well, awesome in certain ways, right? Catherine's going, well, yeah. Rather, right. So, right. So basically what we're talking about here, and there's lots of commentary on this, right, is people look deep into what happened with Yael and Sisera, right, this maternal sort of thing, the ideas of milk and where he was on her lap, and like all kinds of stuff like that. But that's the scene that we're drawing for ourselves, right? Sisera, who's this Canaanite commander, right? His armies are defeated by Deborah and Barak, right? Deborah's power with God. God totally messes with them, right? And Sisera escapes on foot and goes to who he thinks is a friend. As it turns out, not so much, right? Okay, that's the context. So a couple notes I want to give you, and then we're going to move to the song itself. Okay, the story presents an account of the battle between a coalition of northern Israelite tribes, right? Naphtali and Zebulun, right? And Canaanite armies. Okay, this is the prose part, and in a minute we're going to get to the poetry part that comes right after. The battle was part of the wars of liberation that completed the conquest begun by Joshua, right? In the mid-12th century BCE. In other words, this is part of the story of the Israelites conquering Canaan, okay? This is how they get this particular thing, okay? In both versions of this story, the prose which we just read and the poetry which we will read in a moment, two women, meaning Deborah, the prophetess and the judge, from the region of Ephraim, a northern region, and Yael, a tent dweller of the Kenite tribe, are given sort of power and influence. Both versions, prose and poetry, portray God's intervention on the behalf of God's people. The prose account uses the narrative voice. It opens with Deborah sitting in judgment near the palm tree, a charismatic judge. She's got the power. People come to her, right? A couple notes about the text itself. When they say Jabin, king of Canaan, there was no single king of Canaan. So it's sort of a hyperbole at the time. Hazor was an important city, so my guess is it was a ruler who thought he was king. Okay? Interesting that when people analyze this story from the prose section, Deborah, the prophetess, Barak, the army commander, and Yael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, all contribute to achieving delivery from the Canaanite enemy. But none of them is called a deliverer because it takes all three of them to do it. Okay? In Jewish tradition, the song, and actually this part and the song are part of a Haftarah portion called Beshalah, from Beshalah. Okay? The Torah reading relates that God confused the camp of Egypt, that they drowned in the sea and not one of them remained. In other words, the Haftarah portion that accompanies the Torah portion is the Torah portion when the Egyptians go into the sea and God destroys them. That's the pairing that they do. And we've talked about how and why the rabbis and the sages attach certain Haftarah portions to certain things. Sometimes it's a big connection, Sometimes it's not so big connection. This is the same thing, God intervening on the Israelites' behalf, okay?
Is there any narrative backstory about Yael and her relationship to the Canaanites?
Nothing. There's nothing. There's nothing. That's for our imagination, right? A little bit of importance before we get into the song itself. Most scholars believe that the story was actually composed as an interpretation of the song, meaning the song came first. And we're going to read the song in a moment. Stylistically, the song is what we would call archaic Hebrew, and it's extremely difficult. In places perhaps corrupt. The scholars believe this might be some of the oldest Hebrew in the entire Tanakh, Deborah's song. Okay? It was most likely created in the north, they believe, at the time. But it is a hymn of praise and thanksgiving, extolling God for overcoming the enemies that threatened God's people. The poem itself is written, this is Judges 5:1 through 31, right? It's in first person, presented from the viewpoint of the speaker. Readers would sing the song, maybe, we don't know. I mean, we're not sure about poetry. Maybe they would say it, maybe they would sing it. But then identify with the speaker, okay? The scholars believe this poem, this Deborah's song, was probably created around 1100 BCE. There's lots in the Hebrew archaic stuff that there's like a lot of things that are uncertain. A lot of things were scrambled in Scrabble transmission. So we're going to do our best with English translation here. But if you were to read it in a Tanakh, you would see a lot of asterisks that say Hebrew uncertain or Hebrew's difficult or whatever it is. Okay? So before we get into a little more notes, we'll take some turns reading Deborah's song. I've taken the JPS translation from this, okay? Just like any other poem, which we're going to talk about in terms of inset poems in a little bit, it starts with, on that day, Deborah and Barak, son of Abinoam, sang. Okay, so imagine it ends, right? It ends with the hand of the Israelites bore harder and harder on King Jabin of Canaan until they destroyed King Jabin of Canaan. On that day, Deborah and Barak, son of Abinoam, sang this song about it, right? Except we know that the song came first. But so, someone want to read until they get tired?
I will.
Okay, Deb, go for it.
When locks go untrimmed in Israel, when people dedicate themselves, bless Yahweh, hear, O kings. Give me, O potentates. I will sing to Yahweh, will hymn Yahweh, the God of Israel. O Yahweh, when you came forth from Seir, advanced from the country of Edom, the earth has trembled, the heavens dripped, yea, the clouds dripped water, the mountains quaked. Before Yahweh, hymn of Sinai, before Yahweh, God of Israel. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Yael, caravans ceased, and wayfarers went by roundabout paths. Deliverance ceased in Israel, till you rose, O Deborah, arose, O mother in Israel. When they chose new gods, was there a fighter then in the gates? No shield or spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. My heart is with Israel's leaders. With the dedicated of the people, bless Yahweh. You riders on tawny she-asses, you who sit on saddle rugs, and you wayfarers, declare it, louder than the sound of archers. There among the watering places, let them chant the gracious acts of Yahweh, his gracious deliverance of Israel. Then did the people of Yahweh march down the gates.
Wonderful, beautiful. So you can, we'll go into a little more detail, but you get the idea here. This is a hymn of praise, extolling God. It was God It was Yahweh who saved us. It was Yahweh's power that defeated the enemy. Oh, how awesome is Yahweh. Okay, verses 4 through 11 depict God's theophany, the difficult situation of God's people and its hope for salvation. And then we're going to get to 11 through 23 or 12 here. Awake, awake, O Deborah. Who'd like to continue? Andre, okay.
Awake, awake, Deborah. Awake, awake, strike up the chant. Arise, O Barak, take your captives, O son of Abinoam. Then was the remnant made victor over the mighty. Yahweh people won my victory over the warriors. From Ephraim came they whose roots are in Amalek. After you came Benjamin. From Machir came down leaders from Zebulun, such as hold the marshal staff, and Issachar chiefs were with Deborah. As Barak, so was Issachar, rushing after him into the valley. Among the plans of Reuben were great decisions of heart. Why then did you stay among the sheepfolds and listen as they piped for the flocks? Among the plans of Reuben were great searchings of heart. Gilead tarried beyond the Jordan, and then why did he linger by the ships? Asher remained at the seacoast and tarried at his landing. Zebulun is a people that mocked at death, Naphtali on the open heights. Then the kings came, they fought. The kings of Canaan fought at Taanach by Megiddah's water. They got no spoil of silver. The stars fought from heaven. From the courses they fought against Sisera. The torrent Kishon swept them away. The raging torrent, the torrent Kishon, march on my soul with courage. Then the horses' hoofs pounded as headlong galloped the steeds.
Thank you. So you'll notice in this column here, all of these are talking about the tribes of Israel. Okay, they're talking about Zebulun, Reuben, Gilead, Dan, Naphtali, right? These are all tribes of Israel. And I remember at this point, there's no kingdom. So if you look at that old map, right, and you see here's the tribes, right?
And
Here's the ones.
those who didn't come.
Yes, here are the ones who fought with us, and here are the ones who didn't, right? In other words, Israel's all over the place at this point, right? Some tribes go with them, and some tribes don't. We read in the story, it was Naphtali and Zebulun that went with him, right? The other ones, they're saying, hey, where were you, right? What's the deal, right? This is all, and this is going to give us some insight, right, as we move into the next teaching session where we're going to talk about what happened and the kingdom and all that sort of stuff. This is going to give us a little bit of intro. This is one of the oldest pieces of Hebrew, right? Meaning someone wrote this and they had these opinions about the tribes that were going on, meaning there's no kingdom at this point. Everyone's out for themselves. Some people plan together and other people don't, right? Very good observation. Okay? Don't worry about all these names and places, and so don't get out, right? Focus on what we're talking about here. The Israelite warriors, in contrast with the Canaanite kings, they're talking about here's the good people, here's the bad people, right? It's talking about where this is happening, right? The Kishon is a river by the Megiddo, these waters, right? This is, I'm not sure if it was actually sung. If it was, it's a tough song, right? There's a lot of stuff. But you can hear in verse 12, certainly, awake, awake, O Deborah, awake, awake, strike up the chant. Arise, O Barak, take your captives, O son of Abinoam, right? This is very poetic. And remember, this is poetry. It's not meant to be straightforward, right? All the poetry that we look at, Psalms and that sort of stuff, are like this. There's all kinds of just real poetic elements into this, okay?
And there's a reference to Wadi Kishon, so it looks like
Right.
it was a dry river that became a torrent.
Right. Exactly.
To kill.
Right, and so that's their interpretation, right? Is the wadi, and then it's a torrent, and it's right, and it's all God's power, right? There's all kinds of interpretation of it all, okay? But these are mapped out places, okay? So we're going to look at a map later in the lesson, is to see like, because we want to talk about where they were, where they came from. Wadi Kishon, that's a real place, right? It's on the map.
So are you suggesting, okay, that the speaker, the voice of the speaker, omniscient, kind of knows everything?
Sure, yeah.
Comes down on high,
Right.
tells us, you know, you awake. And then, how, I just wanna, help me understand.
Sure,
this.
sure.
It's, among the clans of Reuben were great searchings of heart. So is that saying that that tribe couldn't decide what side to take?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, read the verse before it,
Okay.
right?
And
Among the
listen-
clans of Reuben were great decisions of heart. Why did you stay among the sheepfolds?
Oh, and listen, as they pipe for the flock.
What are you doing?
Yeah, you could be watching those sheep.
Right.
Or you could come.
Or
and
you
fight.
could come and fight the Canaanites, man,
Yeah.
right? That's right. So, you know, these are the songs you would sing.
So this narrator, or this speaker, is
Right.
getting into every little tribe's head and going, now these people were.
Right. At least these northern tribes. We don't hear about other tribes, right? We don't hear about Judah, and we don't hear about, let's see, I wrote it down. Oh, come on. Oh, well, I had it written down. But anyway, it only mentions
Gilead.
Judah, Simeon, and Levi.
Okay,
Gilead, right, so it doesn't mention a lot of southern tribes.
I see, but Gilead is a northern tribe.
Right,
Part of-
so it mentions only some of the
I
tribes.
see.
Now, that's up to interpretation, why?
It's a poem, I would.
It's a poem, right, exactly, it's a poem. Either they don't care about them, or they don't know about, I don't know, I mean, like, you know, that's the fun parts of poems, we get to say, who knows, right? Okay, Rob, do you want to read, okay, 23 through 31. This is focusing on Yael, who represents victory, contrasted with, as we're going to see, Sisera's mother. This is where,
It's
so what?
Who is Morose? Morose?
Curse Morose, said the angel of Yahweh. Canaanite.
Okay.
Canaanite. And it's interesting that Yael isn't talked about as a traitor, but I guess that would be another story.
That's another story. Well, let's read through this last thing and see what they do say about her.
Curse Meroz, said the angel of Yahweh. Bitterly curse its inhabitants, because they came not to the aid of Yahweh, to the aid of Yahweh among the warriors. Most blessed of women be Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite. Most blessed of women in tents. He asked for water, she offered milk. In a princely bowl she brought him curds. Her left hand reached for the tent pin, her right for the workman's hammer. She struck Sisera, crushed his head, smashed and pierced his temple. At her feet he sank, lay outstretched. At her feet he sank, lay still. Where he sank, there he lay, destroyed. Through the window peered Sisera's mother. Behind the lattice she whined. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why so late the clatter of his wheels? The wisest of her ladies give answer. She too replies to herself. They must be dividing the spoil they have found, a damsel or two for each man. Spoil of dyed clothes for Sisera, spoil of embroidered cloths. A couple of embroidered cloths round every neck as spoil. So may all your enemies perish, O Yahweh. But may his friends be as the sun rising in night.
So first of all, this is really good writing, okay? Sometimes when we read and I say, ugh, no good, this is good writing,
Why?
okay? Listen to the poetry in the way that it changes the perspective. In the prose, right, we see, okay, Yael goes in there, kills Sisera. The poem, all of a sudden we get the perspective of Sisera's mother.
Yeah.
Through the window she peered. Behind the lattice she whined. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Listen to how the tone starts to feel, right? How we start to move into tragedy a little bit, right? Why so late the clatter of his wheels? Where's my son?
But I do like
Right.
the way they go into the, must be. because-
Well, it must be because they're dividing the spoil. He must have won. And they're so late because, right, a damsel or two for each man. It takes him a while to get through that, okay? Right? There's too many scarves he's got to wear, right? It's very good writing. It's very good poetry,
It is
okay?
narrative.
It changes the tone immediately. It is amazing writing. And a lot of the book of Judges is like this. It's great writing. A couple notes on this, and then we're gonna move to a certain particular aspects of the poem that we're gonna talk about. As we said, the whole Song of Deborah appears to be Israelite, meaning northern, okay, the northern tribes. It probably has been revised a couple times. It's probably been reconstructed and redacted a couple times. And we're going to talk about some ways that we can see proof of that, okay? You'll see that the name Israel only occurs in verses 2 through 11. So that's sort of interesting, right? The main composition may have occurred by the combination of two prior poems bound together. Now, if you have studied with me biblical poetry, you will have learned that this is not unique, that psalms are usually constructions of two or more poems put together. When you see person change, sometimes it's a stylistic thing, but sometimes it's two poems put together. You'll see the change of them put together, all of a sudden it's a Thanksgiving poem, then it's a lamenting poem. The fact that they combine poems together, that happened all the time, okay? The Yael section, this is verses 24 on the third column, right? It includes no reference to Israel, right? So we're not even really sure where that might have come from. Verses 14 through 18 present a detailed portrait of military alliance involving many groups, right? We talked about that, 14 through 18, all the tribes of Israel, right? So you can start to see maybe how this was put together, right? It's woohoo God and Israel. Here's a tribal militaristic poem, and then here's this beautiful, heartbreaking story of Sisera's mother. Maybe those were put together, right? The majority of the poem is considered, as we said, to be really old. 1100 BCE, really old. Okay, if the monarchy existed, it would probably be, Israel fell in 722. Jerusalem fell in 586. The Torah was redacted and canonized in the 1st century CE. So we're talking about 1,000 years before. Okay, so, a lot of the stuff we think was written post-exilic, meaning 500 BCE and on. So we're talking about 500-600 years before that, okay? Pretty old, okay? But verses 4 and 5. Turn the page. Verses 4 and 5. These are not from the original text. At least we don't think so. We see in Psalm 68, verses 8 through 9, almost identical to it. Real quick in terms of looking at this, which I've given you both sides, right? So in Judges 5:4-5. Now in the JPS translation, I want to make a quick note. If you go down to the bottom there, and it says, let me read. Yahweh, when you came out from Seir, when you marched forth from the fields of Edom, the earth trembled and the skies dripped. Even the clouds dripped water. Mountains flowed like water from before Yahweh. This is Sinai, from before Yahweh, God of Israel. Now, I've actually taught on this passage here for another reason altogether, and we'll get to that. But the JPS translates it as him of Sinai, meaning that God of Sinai, but the Hebrew is Ze Sinai. So I think it's really better, and the scholars agree, this is Sinai rather than him of Sinai, but both are fine. But the idea is this part right here, this is Sinai, or him of Sinai, is an insert, and we're going to talk about why. It is a scribal gloss that they call. persuades the reader to constitute the general allusion of the events here to Mount Sinai, where Moses received the Decalogue. Okay, we're nowhere near Sinai, right? We're nowhere near any of that. Okay, this is about a battle, right? But the idea is to do this. Okay, by the insert of the words, this is Sinai, the editor hoped we would read, the earth trembled like at Sinai, right? Meaning like, right? Like, hey guys, remember Sinai? Same kind of earthquake, okay? It could not, despite this addition, right, it's clear that the episode in Judges 5 could not have had the Decalogue in mind, even if the authors knew it. Probably did not occur, right? They would not have had Sinai in mind. You can tell from the rest of the poem. They barely had Israel in mind, right? The battle scene being described took place, quote, in the days of Shamgar son of Anath, in the days of Israel. God is described from coming forth from Seir and Edom. Okay, the context of the chapter, Seir and Edom, these are places in that. Starting with Judges 3, right? The book of Judges describes a series of military defeats and subjugations. In other words, like I said, it starts off by saying the Israelites were not doing something good, and so God was punishing them. Either they won or they didn't win, right? That's really what the book of Judges is about, okay? In the narrative that we read, right, in the King Yavin of Canaan entrusts the subordination of the populace to his commander, Sisera. Sisera is the name, who is described as having oppressed the Israelites ruthlessly for 20 years. He's ultimately defeated by Yael, whose murder of Sisera is understood to be engineered by God. Okay, in other words, if Jael didn't just randomly do this, this was all the hands of how Yahweh defeats Sisera's army. Okay? And such, the fall of Sisera and eventually the king Jabin is attributed to God's military might. This is shown so far in the, not just in the prose, but in the poetry as well. Okay? It is as if God were awakened. This is David Aaron who says this. It is as if God were awakened from a slumber or brought back from a self-imposed exile, having left Israel's side on account of their former sins. That God is described assuming forth from Seir and Edom, two names for one location, by the way, associated with the mountains. Makes all the more absurd the scribal attempt to have us read this passage as describing Sinai. Okay? Sinai is completely out of place here. And when I teach about this, I teach about it in, and I taught this last year, in a lesson called A Silence Too Loud, that Sinai was most likely a construction after the exile. But this is one of the points that we'll see where Sinai was put in to say, hey, think about Sinai, okay, by the redactors, okay? And that's a fascinating thing to talk about, but I don't want us to get us too off track. But the idea is that, that because the Torah begins and ends in the wilderness, and the Jerusalem has been destroyed, they can't say Zion anymore. They need a new place where they can get their rules, and it's in the middle of nowhere, meaning Jews can exist anywhere in the diaspora. But there's a lot more to that. But these parts are, we believe, redactions that add in, this is Sinai. What else? Okay. Michael Fishbane notes that the hymns are songs of victory, that maybe it comes from another book somewhere that has been lost. Numbers 21:14 mentions a book called the Book of Wars of Yahweh. We never hear from it again, and we have no idea what it is. But it's cool to think about that inside this book, right, a poem like this may have existed. Okay, the image of Sisera's mother peering through the window. This is illustrates how Judges 5 uses an epic motif. A motif, as we've talked about, friends, is characteristics that we can see. The only way we can see it is if it's repeated. Last time we talked about the type scene, right, of how prophetic succession went. That was a motif adaptation. We also have spoken in our class about the sister wives motif adaptation and the rock water motif adaptation. In other words, it's a similar story using elements from something else, okay? So this scene that we see of Sisera's mother, okay, there is a motif of a mother of the hero awaiting with her maids the return of the hero's chariot, little suspecting his gruesome death. A couple examples of this. If you've read the Iliad, Andromache stands on the turrets of Troy, awaiting the return of her husband Hector, the great hero of battles, whose violent death is known to the reader. The image of Michal, the daughter of Saul, looking from her royal window at the processional beginning of the Ark of Jerusalem. The Hebrew, really fascinating. The Hebrew in Michal, Nishkava be'ed ha'holon in 2 Samuel, and bi'ad ha'holon nishkava in Judges 5:28. This actually echoes 8th century ivories circulated throughout the Mediterranean. You can also see in 2 Kings imagery like this. So the image of a mother or a queen looking out, waiting the son's return is actually like an epic sort of motif that is used over and over again, okay? Let's see what I put in yours to make sure. Oh, good, okay. So there's the 2 Samuel 6:16. As the ark of Yahweh entered the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw King David leaping and whirling before Yahweh, and she despised him for it. Jehu went on to Jezreel. This is 2 Kings 9:30. When Jezebel heard of it, she painted her eyes with kohl and dressed her hair, and she looked out the window. In the Hebrew, as you can see below, 2 Samuel, Nishkafa ba'al hahalon. In Judges, ba'ad hahalon nishkafa. And in Kings, v'tishkef ba'ad hahalon. So very similar. You can, in the Hebrew it's easier, but you can see out of the window she peered is like an epic thing that's happening on, okay? The Iliad, right? But fair, Andromache not he heard, nor knew by sure report Hector's delay without the city gates, right? She in a closet in her palace sat, a twofold web, weaving magnificent, right? I mean, this is a scene, right, that they're painting from the time. I have no idea.
I know what it is.
What is it?
It's a black stick. We call it eyeliner today. but
Eyeliner.
It is made out of coal and wax, and women use it on their eyes.
Thank you. I looked at that and I thought, I don't know what that is.
Yeah,
So-
no, she's supposed to look scary.
Right. Right.
They were just beautiful.
Right. Okay. So, a couple notes on the poem itself. So turn, if you will, back to the poem. Let me get myself there too. And I've bolded a couple things for you to talk about that might have been a little unclear. It starts out that day, right? So on that day, Deborah and Barak, son of Abinoam, sang, "When locks go untrimmed in Israel, when people dedicate themselves." What the heck does that mean? The Hebrew is difficult. The translation alludes to the phenomenon of Nazarites, who dedicate themselves to warfare wearing long hair. I think I give you, yes, the Nazarite vow.
Yeah, I was thinking that it was
Oh, good.
non-believers.
Yes,
Because they were the ones that would have the hair not trimmed appropriately.
right. When locks go untrimmed, right? The Nazarite vow, Nazir means the consecrated or the separated. This comes from Numbers 6, right? Yahweh spoke to Moses saying, "Speak to the Israelites. If anyone, man or woman, explicitly utters the Nazarite vow the consecrated, or the vow of separation, sort of, to set him apart for God. These were the real, these are, Nazarites are like super Jews, right? Throughout the term of his vow, no razor shall touch his head. It shall remain consecrated until the completion of his term as a Nazarite of Yahweh, the hair of his head being left to grow untrimmed. So there, we don't know, but we're thinking, right, that's what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about people who are as holy, as dedicated as the Nazarites, okay? And this is, by the way, what we have to do when we find a poem. We have to, pick stuff out and be like, what are they talking about here? What are the references?
Nazarites were a Jewish tribe?
Nazarite means consecrated or separated, which means you could become a Nazarite. You're still Israelite, but you could become a Nazarite. You could be someone who's like even more holy. So the Nazarite, if you wanted to take the Nazarite vow, you could, but you're still Israelite.
I see.
Okay? Rashi says the phrase refers to disturbances or even disasters that confronted Israel. Okay, another translation that this might be, okay? An alternative translation is when breaches are made in Israel, when the people offer themselves willingly. That's how hard the Hebrew is, okay? It could be when locks go untrimmed. It could be when breaches are made in Israel, right? When breaches come upon Israel, for their enemies made breaches in them because they first...
So if you're trimming locks, then you're not as holy as you could be, because everyone were in Nazareth. And locks go untrimmed, so people are not taking the vow. Is that one?
Well, you're not supposed to...
You're not supposed to take the
Not
vow?
supposed to trim your locks, right? Your no razor shall touch your head, which means,
not
so when they're untrimmed, woohoo, we're all holy,
Oh,
right?
that's true, yeah.
Right.
Oh, gotcha.
But it could be metaphorical. The Hebrew is ambiguous. It could mean when breaches are made. It could also mean when bonds were loosened in Israel, the people answered the call. This is how hard the Hebrew is, okay? So I'm just going to give you the examples here. If we go to when bonds were loosened in Israel, this might refer to a time of military crisis, when ordinary social and political order was in abeyance or suspension. Rashi, our 10th century, says, when breaches come upon Israel, for their enemies made breaches in them because they forsook God, and the masses feel motivated to repent.
What's a breach? What does it mean for a breach?
When breaches are made in Israel, when,
Incursions?
yeah,
Physical?
yeah, right? The enemies made breaches in them. Now, that could be physical breaches, or remember that the story begins with the Israelites.
These don't even seem close
Yeah.
in meaning, like
In-
not even close.
In the
So
Hebrew, it's that ambiguous,
when locks go untrimmed, that would mean when things are really holy, right?
right?
Really, really holy.
Right.
Could be a good thing.
Could be a good thing,
In the eyes of
right?
Yahweh, but
Yeah,
this is like, oh,
completely
my
opposite,
man.
completely opposite. Isn't that great? Isn't that great when that happens?
Yeah, fun.
Right? The one way that you read one verse and it could mean completely opposite, right? Another couple things to mention. Judges 5:30. This is at the very end, right? When we see the reason why Sisera's mother, or the maidservants of Sisera's mother, are saying, "Don't worry," right? He's probably delayed because of this, right? They must be dividing the spoil they found, a damsel or two for each man, right? Spoil of dyed cloths for Sisera, spoil of embroidered cloths, a couple of embroidered cloths around every neck of spoil. So a couple of things. The reason for the delayed return, they imagine, is that the victorious warriors are taking time to gather booty, okay? And by the way, by booty, we mean spoils, okay, not the other thing. Though,
Each man.
It could use swords,
there is,
chariots,
right,
and things like that.
correct. The dyed cloths, the embroidered dyed cloths, we know from Exodus 26 that those are expensive. Garments were embroidered with colored threads. So we see from Exodus 26 You shall make a screen for the entrance of the tent of blue and purple and crimson yards and fine twisted linen. Okay, meaning this is expensive stuff. It's important stuff, right? Techelet, right, exactly. You'll also say they will find and share the spoils, 2 damsels to every man. Rashi says they are ravishing the pretty women of Israel, and every one of them, of the men, has 2 or 3 women in his bed. No wonder he's delayed, right? So that's super fun. Another translation, a maiden, 2 maidens for every warrior. Susan Ackerman says that while the attendant can only fantasize that Sisera's delay is caused by the gathering of a maiden or 2 maidens for each warrior's sexual gratification, we know from verse 27, and indeed from the 26 verses that precede it, that just the opposite is the case. Right? He is delayed because he has been knocked in the temple by a woman, right? You know, feel free to go into the phallic interpretation of the pin and the maternal aspect, all of that, okay? Although it's 1 maiden, Deborah, and 2 maidens, Deborah and Yael, who have brought about Sisera's delay, right? So maybe it's a play on that, right? Sisera himself has been ravaged by the very woman he and his army were attempting to ravage. The only women who will be part of Sisera's entourage in the future then are his mother and her female courtiers as they march and mourn at his funeral procession. How about that for poetry, huh? Pretty gruesome. Pretty gruesome. Let's look at archaeological connection to the battle, friends. And I've got a nice little map for you as well. Okay? Does anyone have a clock to know how we're doing on time? 12 after 3. Okay, so we've got like 15 minutes. Okay, good. So a couple things. If we read Judges 4:1 through 4:4, I want you guys to pay attention to a couple things here, okay? It says, the Israelites did what was again offensive to Yahweh, and Yahweh surrendered them to King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. His army commander was Sisera. The Israelites cried out to Yahweh, for he had 900 iron, right? We read this. Deborah, right, blah, blah, blah. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, okay? And the Israelites would come to her for decisions. Now, Ephraim is in the north, okay? And you'll see this awesome map over here. So 2 that I've put together. In the black and white is Ephraim. It shows you where it is, okay, in theory, all right? And in a minute, we're going to connect those to the battles and the stuff that we see in this other map, okay? But before we do that, I want to speak about the Merneptah stele for a second. The Merneptah stele, which was dated to about 1230 BCE, also known as the Israel stele. It's a slab of rock which was found in 1896 in Egypt. And the monument where it was found once stood at the temple that honored Pharaoh Merneptah. That's why it's called the Merneptah stele, okay? Some of it refer to the victory stele because it records the military campaigns and victories of Pharaoh Merneptah, the son of mighty Ramses II, who reigned in Egypt under 1215. It has long been touted the earliest extra-biblical reference to Israel. It was discovered in Thebes in the late 1800s, and the inscription contains a hymn and a list of Pharaoh's military victories. The nation of Israel is on that list of conquests, which scholars believe to be the earliest reference to Israel outside the Bible. Okay? Here is the reference that we read from 1230 BCE. Okay? The kings are overthrown, saying, Salam. Not one holds his head among the 9 bows. Wasted is Tenahu, Keta is pacified, plundered is Canaan, with every evil carried off is Ashkelon, seized upon is Gezer, Yanoam is made a thing not existing. Israel is desolated, his seed is not. Palestine has become a widow for Egypt. So just to give you guys some awesomeness here, to let you guys know, this shows a couple things. One, this is the only time we have heard during this period that Israel and Egypt are even connected, okay? There is no archaeological evidence that we were ever in Egypt as slaves, but this tells us that for real, Egypt conquered us at a certain point. So first of all, that is awesome. So a couple things about what it says, and then we're going to get to how that relates to Deborah's song. Don't worry, we're not going crazy. Or it says, Israel is desolated, his seed is not, or is bare of seed. Israel was probably an agricultural society, means they've burned all the fields of Israel, okay? This tells us, by this alone, okay, and this is all we get, this little mention. We know Israel existed, we don't know what it was. Was it a kingdom? Was it a tribe? Was it a state? Was it something? We actually don't know from that perspective, okay? The term Israel did not originate as the monarchy, as the kingdom of Israel, but a people without kings. In other words, during Deborah's time and Judges' time, Israel was the Israelites, some sort of tribe, some sort of group, right? So we're seeing that takes place. Now, here's where it gets super fun. Stay with me, friends. Ramses III, the successor to Merneptah. Okay, Merneptah was the pharaoh who wrote, hey, I destroyed all these people, how awesome am I? Okay? Ramses III, they found in 1210, 20 years later, okay, in his temple recording, it says, year 8 under the majesty of Ramses III, the foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. For Kate, Kod, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alisha, these are all Eastern Mediterranean states and people near the Levant, the water, okay? Being cut off at one time. A camp was set up in one place in Amor. They desolated its people. Its land was like that which has never come into being, okay? Now, let's deconstruct this, okay? They're talking about,
This was Egyptian,
this is Egyptian, Ramses III.
so this is a translation from the hieroglyphics.
Correct. For whatever it was written in 1210, you know. So what it's talking about is all of these people near the water, okay, all of the tribes and stuff near the water were destroyed, okay? Now, why is this important? If you read the final section of the Merneptah palette, right, the first one that we said, okay, Merneptah doesn't actually say that it was him who destroyed Israel. He just says, it's in the passive voice. It's destroyed, okay? He's simply taking credit for it, which, by the way, Egyptian pharaohs are notorious for, okay? They have, according to Egyptian history, they have won every battle, and they all did it, okay? It's written in the passive voice without a named agent. It's actually generally assumed that the agent responsible for these activities was Merneptah, but others believe it may have been carried out by someone else. All these people, remember, were by the sea, okay? And there's always the danger, all the way back to the Torah, of the danger of the sea people, the people who would come in. Sometimes they're called Philistines, sometimes they're just called sea people. Abraham avoids it, right? There's always a problem with the sea people, okay? The sea people, according to history, were responsible for wasting, plundering, and carrying off, and desolating, according to Ramses III, all of these places: Tehanu, Keta, Canaan, Ashkelon, Gezer, Yonam, and probably Israel. We were up by the sea too. Okay, now it doesn't say it specifically, but if Ramses III is telling us that this is what it was, it's possible that someone else actually conquered us, not Egypt. And Merneptah just took credit for it. It is possible then that Deborah's song preserves an Israelite battle against these people. Okay? Really interesting why. Okay? The sea people at the time, called the Shardana, existed around this time, around the Levant. Okay? The connection was made when scholars studying some of the archives found at Ugarit, near the Mesopotamia, located in the north of the battleground of modern-day Ras Shamra, discovered the name of a prince nearby, Shardana colony, dating to the 14th century. His name was Sisera. The very same name found in the poem of Judges 5. So we always have to know what happened, where do these names come from, right? So we shift back to the poem. It tells of a battle that occurs between Megiddo and Tanakh. I think, Andre, you read that, right? Megiddo and Tanakh. Yeah, here we go. The kings came, they fought. The kings of Canaan fought at Tanakh by Megiddo's water. They got no spoil of silver. Adam Zertel, an archaeological professor, has found evidence of the Shardana settlement, the sea people, right, just south of this location. The settlement dates to about 1220 to 1170 BCE, around within the time that the poem might have been written. And after 1170 BCE, it hadn't been occupied, meaning that maybe the Israelites beat them and destroyed the Shardana, I mean. So we see in this map here, okay, the Kishon River, right, which we read about, the Kishon, the torrent of the Kishon, right, on the black and white map, Haroshet Hagoyim, this is where Sisera's army came from, down to Megiddo, and here it says Haroshet Hagoyim, right, El Ahawat, are basically the same area, okay? So that even when Sisera's army says it came from Haroshet Hagoyim, there is evidence of Shardana sea people at that area. So who then came down. So what we're trying to show, what I'm trying to show you here, is if we go back to the poem, okay? It's talking about all these things, all these people, right? These Canaanite, this King Jabin of Canaanite, at least the song is, right? It's talking about victory and all this sort of stuff, but it talks about the kings of Canaan at Tanakh, Megiddo's water, right? All these sort of things. And it has the mention of this guy, Sisera, who was a chieftain of this Shardana, of these sea people. So what we're trying to see is, was it a battle against the sea people that was then repurposed into a Canaanite battle, right? And rewritten in the prose to say King Jabin or whatever it is, or not, right? We're not sure. But it's very, very cool to think that they have found the remains in these areas where, if the poem is correct and they destroyed the Shardana, the archaeology points to that there's no more left after that point at 1170. There's no more parts, right? And the poem is dated about that time, meaning that if they destroyed the sea people and they wrote a song about it, it was great. But then, a little bit later, the prose is rewritten, and, that's a little bit different. From the Egyptian side, the archaeology helps us by thinking about that Merneptah is saying, well, by the way, Egyptian stuff, they always win, right? No one ever loses. So, seriously, they've never lost a battle in like 4,000 years. So they're saying Israel is laid to bear. They were in a battle, right? It never says that they had anything to do with it, right? And then Ramses III says, wait a minute, all these people who were right around the same area, right? Kate, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, Alishea, right? All of it's desolated. right? So we're not sure who won the battle, right? But certainly other areas were aware of this battle that occurred. Deborah's saying, we won, right? Egypt says they lost, right?
It's still happening today.
And, right, so, right. So, so very, very cool in terms of how we can relate that to modern day stuff.
67 war.
Oh, to say nothing of today, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, but, so some believe that the Song of Deborah could preserve an Israelite battle against the Shardana, a warlike group of sea peoples that occupied the area of the Levant from the 14th century and later. Other people disagree, right? Most importantly, that we will move on and talk about another day, is the Merneptah tablet, the Merneptah stele, gives us another inside look.
What is a stele?
It's just a stele is like
One that's been written on.
yeah, it's a tablet. Yeah. And it's spelled the way it's spelled, S-T-E-L-E. But a lot of the reasons why the scholars who believe that Merneptah actually did conquer Israel really like the Merneptah stele, because that leads them to the idea that instead of Israel being enslaved by Egypt, we were just a vassal of some kind to Egypt. And the Merneptah stele tells us that Merneptah took control of us and we paid tribute and that sort of stuff. There's other things that mention that we pay tribute, you know, so that the story of Egypt, us in Egypt, is a reinterpretation of being under the power or the control of Egypt. And then when Egypt loses power, the Exodus happens. Awesome stuff, but not what we're talking about today. So, but what I hope that we gain from this is a couple things. And we went deep down the rabbit hole, didn't we? But what I hope we gain from this, one, is appreciation for the awesome writing in Judges. Two, for the idea of inset poetry, which we love to talk about. Inset poetry, meaning the poetry that just sort of shows up from time to time in our Tanakh, not in the Psalms, right? Like the Song of the Sea, right? That just pops up, like the poetry of Balaam, where he stands over and he sings Matovu, right? How beautiful your tents, O Jacob, right? The idea of how these poems were inserted and then reinterpreted through prose, or not, right? It could be that they just were enough by themselves. Here we see in the book of Judges some of the oldest Hebrew we've ever seen inserted into a book about military conquests and a prose writing about it, to talk more about it, and they include the song in it. So I highly recommend reading more Judges, and we'll talk more about that. Next time, we're going to talk about the book of Kings. We're going to talk about the idea of the monarchy, the North and the South, and all of those politics that have to go with it. But any questions before we end? I know I took us deep down today. I couldn't help it.
What's interesting is to remember that, because in our teachings, young and today, you know, the Israelites did this and the Egyptians did that. And like any other history, there's a combination of their tribes, and there's only part of this happening at certain times, and there's other parts happening at other times. So it's not all of Egypt or all of Israel, it's tribes and this and that,
And hyperboles and braggish kings and pharaohs, and you never know, right? We only know what we have, right? History's written by the victor. So whether it's us or them. So.
And I didn't know that Deborah was a judge, that it was.
Yes, a prophetess and a judge. Yeah, so, and by judge, we don't mean a judge today. We mean a charismatic leader who was basically a king without a king, or queen without a queen. So she was in charge at that time. So if you read the book of Judges, you'll see there's a bunch of judges that occur. And yes, a lot of female leadership. You know, this is big. I mean, the fact that Deborah is a prophetess, the fact that Yael is the one who defeats the army commander, this happens a lot. And so there's a great deal of scholarship about the femininity of the book of Judges, and perhaps the influence, perhaps it was a female writer. You know, that sort of fun stuff, so. Any other questions before we end? Mind explodes, head explodes?
Yes.
Everyone have headaches?
The Passover story.
Ruins the Passover story? Oh, that's a totally different lesson. I can really ruin that for you if you want. That's a totally different story. Yeah, I've taught on that one. Yeah, I will totally ruin that for you. Okay, well, friends, thank you very much. We will see you on the 17th, okay? You're welcome.